Okay, is the red recording light on?
Yes.
All right, good. So thanks for coming out tonight and studying the Word of God with us. What I'd like you to do is to put in your imagination that we're all going to get in the church van and we're going to go for a drive. Okay? We're going to leave town, we're going to go up Highway 95 towards Quartzsite. And when we leave Yuma, as we drop down into the river valley, we're going to find ourselves at the Gila River Valley, and we're going to stop and we're going to get out. And I want you to just picture that in your mind, what that looks like. We're standing down in the river. As we turn around and look around us, we see the mountains around us, and there's some bluffs on one side and some bluffs on the other side. And we find ourselves at the western end of Dome Valley. So as we look to the south, we see the hills rise about a football field away. They start to rise out of the valley floor to about 100 feet above us. And as we look on that ridge, we see a bunch of soldiers standing up there. Now, these aren't modern day soldiers like we see around us every day. We're looking at ancient warriors, and they're standing, or they're dressed in full armor, shiny armor. And if we turn around and look to the other side, on the northern bluffs, we see another line of men standing there, but they're not dressed in warrior clothing. They're dressed in their normal clothes, like they have just come out of the fields where they worked and they've shown up for battle. So what I'm trying to get for you to understand is that if we were to take a time machine and go back to the year 1022 BC, we would find ourselves in the valley of Elah, which is about 14 miles from Bethlehem. And the soldiers that are standing there on the southern bluffs, who are all dressed in armor, are the Philistine army, and they have just invaded Judah, which is the home of Israel. And that sorry-looking bunch of soldiers on the other side are the Israelite army, and they're being commanded by King Saul. So this is the setting of the really well-known Bible story in the Old Testament of David and Goliath. That's what it looks like if we were to just show up there today. So, if you want to turn into your Bibles to chapter 1 Samuel chapter 17, we'll get started. In verse 1 it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Ezkah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them." So one of the things as I was studying this passage, I read the chapter before, and I read some of the chapters behind it, and it really kind of put things in perspective. Because in 1 Samuel chapter 16, we're getting introduced to David for the first time, when the prophet Samuel is told by God to go and find the new king of Israel. And that's when Samuel finds David, who happens to be the youngest son of Jesse, who has 8 children. So that's when we meet David. Now we're at David and Goliath. And then the next set of stories talk about how David is qualified to be the king of Israel, yet Saul is not. So that kind of puts it into perspective of where we are in David's life and how this belongs to the history of Israel. So we're standing now on these bluffs, and we're standing there with the Israelite army, and we're looking across, and we see the Philistines. And man, they look like they know what they're doing. They're dressed for battle and all other stuff, and so we're not feeling real good about our chances of winning this battle. But that's not the worst of it, because as we look across the valley, we see, the soldiers kind of breaking ranks, and we see this big guy come walking down the hill, kind of skidding a little bit because it's a steep hill, and then we've got his shield bearer right behind him. And And we can, it's just a long way off, and we can just see that this really big guy is standing over there, and he's walking towards us. And it tells us, this is the first time the Israelites got to see who Goliath is, and their enemy. And the Bible tells us that he is 6 cubits in a span. Now a cubit is 18 inches long, and a span is half that at 9 inches. So if we multiply 6 times 18, that gets us 108, and then we add another half, a span of 9 inches, that's 117. We divide that by 12 inches, and it comes out that this guy is 9 feet, 9 inches tall. Man, that's big. I mean, I am 6 foot tall, so this guy is 3.5 or more feet taller than me. But the Israelites were really short people, especially back then. And so Goliath was probably 4.5 feet or more taller than them. And so here they see this guy that really was a giant to them coming towards them. So Goliath continues to walk across the valley towards them, and he gets to the bottom of the bluff, and the Israelites are looking down at him. And he just starts yelling up at them, and he's taunting them, and he's telling them, what are you guys doing? You showed up here to come to the battle, yet you won't come and fight. And so we'll pick that up back here. In verse 8 he tells us, or the Bible tells us, that Goliath stands there and shouts up to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, then I and my people will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." He goes on to say that I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together. So here's this giant of a man who's yelling up at him. He's cursing the Israelites. He's cursing against God, and he's telling them, you've shown up for battle, but you won't come out and fight. You guys are just a bunch of cowards. But don't even worry about that. Just one of you pick somebody, come down here and fight me, and if I win, then you guys will all be our slaves. And if you can beat me, then we'll all be your slaves. So, verse 11 tells us that when Saul and all of Israel hears this, here's the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So I can kind of see how they'd be afraid. Here's this big guy who's dressed in armor, who looks like he's just a killing machine, and now he's telling me, just come down here and fight me one-on-one. So I can kind of understand why the Israelites were afraid. But we're going to this is a good place to kind of stop a little bit, and we're going to be reintroduced to David in our story. And in verse 12 it says, "Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, and his name was Jesse. And Jesse had 8 sons. In the days of Saul the king, Jesse was already old and advanced in his years." So we take that to mean that Jesse was too old to be a soldier. He was too old to come and fight in the army. But it tells us that 3 of his oldest sons had come and followed Saul, and their names were Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. And David was the youngest of these 8 sons. But we don't know why all of Jesse's sons weren't called up for battle. But we do know that you had to be 20 years old to fight in Saul's army. So we're thinking that at least the youngest 5 ones weren't old enough to fight. Or there may have been some kind of law that said something like, you only have to provide 3 members of your family to fight. But so that's kind of why there was only 3 of these sons that were involved in the army at this time. It tells us that David spent his time going back and forth from his home in Bethlehem, tending his father's flock as a shepherd, and bringing supplies to the camp. And in verse 16 it tells us that for 40 days the Philistine, we're talking about Goliath, came forward and took his stand morning and evening. So twice a day for 40 days, Goliath has come down from his camp, walked across the valley, stood below the Israelite army, and taunted them to get them to come down and fight. And yet nothing has happened. So Jesse, so again, this has been going on for 40 days, and Jesse's a little bit concerned about what's going on with his boys, and so he tells David, David, I want you to go check on your brothers. I want you to take some food to them and some food to their commander, and then I want you to come back and tell me what's going on. I want to know what's happening. I want to make sure that they're okay. And so this was a kind of little bit of a strange contrast for me, because when I look at this, the Bible tells us this has been going on for 40 days. But in the next set of verses, in verse 20, it says, David rose early in the morning. His dad tells him, look, I want you to go do this. So he gets up early the next morning. He gets all of the supplies together. He goes out to check on his sheep to make sure they're okay. He finds another person to watch the sheep while he's gone because he doesn't want to leave them unprotected. And then he travels 14 miles and arrives at the Israelite camp in the morning, just as they're getting ready to go out in formation and go out to their battle lines. And they're screaming and hollering, like psyching themselves up, like they're getting ready to go to war. So the contrast is, here's David, a young boy, who's been told that his dad has told him, I need you to go do this. And David gets up and goes and travels 14 miles to get there in time early enough in the morning to see the army go out to the battle lines. Yet these two armies have been standing there looking at each other for 40 days and haven't done anything. So that's, I don't know if that's really what we're trying to get out of this story, but it just makes you wonder what's going on. Why David could do this and get so much accomplished in such a short amount of time, and yet these armies have spent 40 days kind of blustering at each other. So David makes it there in the morning. He hears all this going on, and he heads out to camp, or he heads into camp, and he drops the supplies of food with the supply keeper that takes care of these things. And then David runs down to the front lines, because his first job was to deliver the food, and his second one was to find out what was going on with his brothers, right? So he runs down to the front lines, and he greets his brothers, and he says, hey guys, what's going on? And at that point in time, he gets to witness Goliath come out and challenge the Israeli army. And this is what it says. As David talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard them. So David hears him going, come on, you cowards, come down here and fight me. Come out, your God is weak and can't protect you. We don't know really what he said, but that's what he was doing. And David is taken aback. He can't believe this. I mean, this is probably the first time in his life he's ever heard anybody be so disrespectful to God. And then he can't believe that no one has done anything to take care of their enemy, to get them to stop him doing this, right? And it tells us in verse 24 that all the men of Israel, when they saw Goliath, they fled from him and were much afraid. But then these guys and the soldiers are standing around talking, and they're going, can you believe this guy? He comes over here, he keeps threatening us, he's scaring us to death. And yet our king has offered to make anybody that volunteers to go fight him a very rich man, and to give him his daughter's hand in marriage, and then to make his whole entire family tax-free in Israel. So this is a huge reward, right? Yet nobody wants to do it. Nobody's stepping up to do it. And so David is just incensed. And he's like, so tell me again, what's going on? What's the reward for this? And so we don't know why David did this. All I can imagine is David is probably telling them, look, you guys, I can't believe no one's doing this. Think of what you've got to gain. You know God is on our side. All we have to do is go down there and take care of this guy. Yet nobody does it. But David's oldest brother is hearing all this. And he can't believe, one, that his brother's doing this. And so let's pick that up in verse 28. It says, now Eliab, his oldest brother, hears when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said to him, "Why have you come down here? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know of your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." So now his oldest brother doesn't know why he's there. He's just assuming that his youngest brother has come down to watch a bunch of men die in battle. He doesn't know that his dad has sent him down there to deliver food for his brothers and to find out how they're doing so he can go back and tell their dad that he's doing okay. But no, his oldest brother just thinks that David has shown up to do evil in his heart. And it just makes me wonder if, when God sent Samuel to pick one of Jesse's sons to be the next king of Israel, why didn't he pick his oldest? But I think it's because his heart was already so hard that he could not be king. He didn't have the faith that David did. And that's why David's youngest son ended up being anointed as king. But David just doesn't take this lying down. So David tells him, "What have I done? What did I do to make you mad? All I did was ask a question." But David's question was, everybody was talking about it, to the point where King Saul hears about it. Hears about somebody talking defiantly about killing Goliath and asking about the reward. So King Saul sends for him and sends David to come. And so when David comes before his presence, David says to King Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him, Goliath. Your servant," talking about David, "will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You're crazy. You're just a little kid. You cannot go fight the Philistine." He says, "You are not able to go fight the Philistine, to fight with him, for you are just but a youth, and he has been a man of war since he was a little kid." He's been killing people since before David was born. He's been killing people since David's age. And yet, here's David, this young kid, who's got all this faith and all this courage, and all his other warriors are not. But David says to Saul, "Your servant," talking about himself, "used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered him out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard." He grabbed him by his throat and he killed him. He continues and he says, "Your servant David has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine." He's so mad at Goliath about what he's saying about God, he can't even call him by his name. "He shall be just like one of those beasts, because he has defied the army of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, he was so convinced of David's faith and his courage, he says, "Go and the Lord be with you." Now, I'm not sure if that was a prayer for David or if it was just his blessing, but David gave him permission to go fight Goliath. Now, you need to understand how a big deal this is. Here we have a king who is risking his throne, he's risking his life, he's risking the lives of the entire Israel people, because if David goes down there and loses, they're all going to be slaves. And a lot of them are going to be killed. But he's got so much, David's faith and his courage has so convinced Saul that this is what's supposed to happen, that Saul gives him his blessing. But Saul wants to protect him the best he can, so Saul gives David Saul's personal royal armor and has him put it on. He puts him in his bronze helmet, he puts him in an armored shirt, and he gives him his sword to fight Goliath. And so David starts to kind of move around in it a little bit, and he can barely move. It's just too heavy for him. And he tells Saul, I can't take this. I haven't tested these weapons, I haven't used this before. I'm just going to have to go fight with what I know. And so he takes all this armor off. He leaves Saul's sword behind him, and he takes his shepherd's staff, his stick, and he takes his sling, and he starts down the hill towards Goliath. So when he gets to the bottom of the hill, he stops in the dry riverbed and he picks up 5 smooth stones and he puts them in his bag. So, when I was thinking about this, a lot of us have heard this story all our lives, and we start thinking, how does just little rock kill this giant of a man? Well, I did a little research, and I found out that the typical stones that they used in slings were about the size of a baseball, but they were very, very heavy. So if we were to take one of those and try to just throw it like a baseball, it probably wouldn't even make it into the front row right here, because they were that heavy. You know, and we probably really hurt our arm to do that. But that's the size, that was the size and the weight of these stones that they used in their slings. And so, you know, that's where this is coming from. So I want you to kind of get an idea of that, what's in your mind. So David puts those in his bag, and he continues out into the valley towards Goliath. And Goliath looks out and he sees somebody coming towards him. And as he gets a little bit closer, he sees that it's just a young boy. And he's insulted that Israel has sent a kid down here to fight him. And not only that, the guy doesn't even have a sword. He's got a stick. And in Goliath's mind, and he says this, in verse 43 it says, the Philistine says to David, am I a dog that you come to beat me with a stick? I mean, that's just how incensed he was, and how furious he was that just this young kid is coming to fight him. And it goes on to say that the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of the hosts, the God of the army of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give your body and the bodies of your entire army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, so that the whole earth will know that there is a God in Israel, and that the Lord saves not with the sword and the spear. So David knows that this isn't a battle between him and Goliath. It's not a battle between the Israelite army and the Philistines. This is a battle between God and the armies of Israel. So David already knows what's going on here. He's not worried about himself. He just knows that to trust God, and that God's going to prevail in this. So, of course, Goliath hears this and gets up from where he's sitting and they're talking. And he starts toward David. But David doesn't wait for the battle to come to him. The Bible tells us that he runs towards Goliath. And as he's running towards him, he reaches into his bag and he pulls out this stone and he sticks it in his sling and he starts whipping it around in the air and he lets it fly. And bam! It hits Goliath right in the forehead. And it sinks into his forehead. It crushes the front of his skull, and Goliath falls on his face to the ground. Well, David just runs up to him at that point in time, because the battle's not over. He draws Goliath's sword, which is probably bigger than him, and then he cuts off the Philistine's head. Well, the Philistines are up there watching all this, and all of a sudden they see this kid kill their champion. And they turn and start running for home. Well, the Israelites also see this, and they're emboldened by what's just happened. And they take off after the Philistines, and they chase them all the way to their homes. And as they catch them, they kill them and leave them for the birds and the animals to eat. You know, so you ever notice that when you're surrounded by success, that people just get encouraged? Well, when you have fearless faith, the same thing happens. It's contagious. So the story ends by David appearing before Saul now, after the battle is over. And he walks before Saul, and he shows him Goliath's head. And Saul asks about David's father, his family, because he has to now make good on this reward. So there you have it. That's the battle between David and Goliath. You know, and it's a pretty neat story. And it's very exciting. And in fact, throughout history, many cultures have described contests between people as stories of David versus Goliath. We hear about it in sports teams all the time, where it's a young team fighting an experienced team that's much bigger, and the young team wins out overall. And that's all pretty neat. And what I really like about that is that cultures have taken something out of the Bible. If they really knew the understanding of it, it would be really a lot better. But there we have it. But that's not why this story was recorded in 1 Samuel 17. The important thing we need to understand here is that David trusted not in his earthly strength, but he trusted in God to win this victory over Goliath. And we, as God's children, can have that power also. We have to develop it. We have to have that faith, and we have to be able to draw from it so that when we face impossible things and situations in our life, we can have that power from God to overcome. You know, our United States Marine Corps, when they go into battle, they take overwhelming firepower with them because they want to go into that battle to defeat their adversary and come home safe and sound. Well, we don't need modern weapons to fight our battles, because chances are we're not going to find ourselves in a war fighting somebody one-on-one. But we need to take the overwhelming firepower of God into anything that we do. The devil doesn't need to tempt unrepentant sinners because he's already got them. But he's going to use everything in his power to come after us because he has to steal us away from God's salvation. So we don't want to go into battle with the devil without taking God with us. That'd almost be like going into taking a knife to a gunfight. We're going to lose, right? So the Apostle Paul, in writing to Ephesians, speaks about putting on the whole armor of God. You know, and I don't know if his thoughts when he was writing this reminded him of David when he wrote this passage, but it really speaks to what David must have been living in his walk with God, because David was prepared with faith to enter this battle with Goliath. Ephesians 6:11 says, "Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil." And verse 16 says, "In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one." So we need to take God with us into our battles by studying the Word of God and by having a deep and strong relationship with Him. We do that by developing an unwavering trust and faith in Him, so that if we find ourselves in a serious illness, if we lose our jobs, if we face severe financial hardships, or when we face temptation, our weapons to overcome, faith, prayer, and trust, have already become practiced skills that are in our innermost being. In each situation, when we trust in God and we trust in His living power to save, we will have the courage to stand, to fight, to endure, and to overcome. So I encourage each one of you to get into the Word of God, to study and pray.